In 1988, a 15-year-old Soviet gymnast named Elena Shushunova stood on the podium in Seoul, gold medal around her neck, smiling for the cameras while hiding two fractured vertebrae that her coaches had known about for months. She had trained through the pain on a diet of injections, silence, and the unshakable conviction that failure was not a personal disappointment, but a betrayal of the state. How did the Soviet Union build the most dominant Olympic machine in history? And what did it cost the human beings who were fed into it? To understand the scale of what the Soviet sports apparatus became, you have to go back to the moment it was born, and the reason it was born was not love of sport. It was fear. In the years after World War II, the Soviet Union found itself locked in a confrontation with the West that extended far beyond nuclear warheads and proxy wars. Culture, science, chess, ballet, space exploration, every domain of human achievement became a front in the Cold War. But nothing delivered ideological validation quite like the Olympics. A gold medal broadcast to billions was proof that the socialist system could produce superior human beings. Stalin understood this instinctively. And so, beginning in the late 1940s, the Soviet state began constructing something unprecedented in the history of sport: a centralized, government-funded, scientifically driven system designed to identify, recruit, train, and optimize athletes on an industrial scale. It was not a sports program, it was a weapons program. And the weapons were children. The system began with selection, and selection began terrifyingly early. Across the Soviet Union, a network of youth sports schools known as DUS, Detsko-Yunosheskaya Sportivnaya Shkola, operated in virtually every city and major town. By the 1970s, there were more than 5,000 of these schools enrolling millions of children. But enrollment was only the first filter. Coaches and sports scientists would visit kindergartens and elementary schools armed with clipboards and measuring tapes. They examined children as young as 4 and 5, looking for specific anthropometric markers, limb-to-torso ratios, joint flexibility, muscle fiber composition estimates, even the shape of a child's feet. A girl with hyperextended knees and long Achilles tendons might be flagged for gymnastics. A boy with broad shoulders and large hands might be steered toward swimming or rowing. The children did not choose. The system chose for them. And once the system chose, the child's life was no longer entirely their own. If you find this kind of hidden mechanism behind Soviet history fascinating, and you want to keep uncovering how systems like this actually worked, consider subscribing to this channel. We dig into the real stories behind the Cold War that most people never hear about. The talent pipeline fed into a tiered structure of escalating intensity. Below the elite level sat regional sports schools, above them sat the schools of higher sportsmanship, and at the very top sat the national training centers, places like Ozero Krugloy outside Moscow for gymnastics, or the rowing facility at Lake Zalov near Tallinn. At each stage, the weak were culled and the strong advanced. The language surrounding this process was clinical. Internal documents from the Soviet Ministry of Sport, many of which were declassified after the fall of the Soviet Union, referred to athletes using production terminology. Children were raw material. Training was processing. Medals were output. This was not metaphor. It was institutional philosophy. And the implications of treating human beings as raw material were exactly what you would expect. Training volumes in Soviet elite sport were, by any modern standard, staggering. Soviet gymnasts in the 1970s and 1980s routinely trained 6 to 8 hours per day, 6 days a week. Some sources describe sessions extending to 10 hours during pre-competition camps. Larisa Latinina, who won 18 Olympic medals between 1956 and 1964, a record that stood for 48 years, later described training regimens that would be classified as abuse by any contemporary sports federation. Young gymnasts were expected to perform hundreds of repetitions of high-impact skills on hard surfaces. Padding was minimal. Recovery time was considered a luxury. The attitude was simple: the body would adapt, or the body would break, and if the body broke, there was another child behind it in the pipeline. This conveyor belt mentality created extraordinary results. Between 1952, when the Soviet Union first competed in the Summer Olympics, and 1988, the last games before the collapse, Soviet athletes won a total of 1,204 Olympic medals. No other country came close, but behind every medal was a story, and many of those stories were not triumphant. Consider the case of Olga Korbut. In 1972, at the Munich Olympics, she captivated the world. She was 17, tiny, electric, performing moves on the uneven bars that no woman had ever attempted in competition. Her back flip on the balance beam became one of the most iconic moments in Olympic history. Western audiences saw a pixie, a sprite, a joyful embodiment of youthful daring. What they did not see was what had happened in the years before Munich. Corbett trained under Reinhold Knisch in Grodno, Belarus, and the training environment was, by her own later testimony, brutal. She described being beaten, starved, and subjected to relentless psychological pressure. She was told she was worthless. She was told she was replaceable. She was trained through injuries that should have ended her career. And Corbett was not an anomaly. She was a product of a system that viewed psychological breaking as a necessary stage in athletic development. The logic was perverse but internally consistent. An athlete who could be broken by a coach could be broken by competition. Therefore, the coach's job was to break the athlete first, rebuild her under controlled conditions, and produce someone who could withstand any pressure. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was cruelty as methodology. The sports science infrastructure behind Soviet training was, in many ways, decades ahead of the West, and this is one of the great ironies of the story. The same system that treated athletes with shocking callousness also pioneered research that forms the foundation of modern exercise science. Soviet scientists were among the first to systematically study periodization, the practice of organizing training into cycles of varying intensity and volume, to optimize performance and reduce injury. Lev Pavlovich Matveyev published his foundational work on periodization theory in 1965, and its influence is still felt in every serious strength and conditioning program on Earth. Soviet researchers at the Central Institute of Physical Culture in Moscow, known as TSNIIFK, conducted rigorous studies on anaerobic threshold, lactate clearance, neuromuscular adaptation, and the biomechanics of virtually every Olympic discipline. They had access to resources that Western sports scientists could only dream of. Thousands of elite athletes as test subjects, centralized data collection, and absolutely no ethical review boards standing in their way. Here is a statistic that illuminates the scale. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union employed an estimated 5,000 full-time sports scientists. The United States, at the same time, had fewer than 100 in comparable roles. The gap was not close. But the science was not limited to training methodology. It extended into pharmacology, and this is where the story takes its darkest turn. The Soviet doping program was not an open secret. It was a state secret, organized at the highest levels of government, funded by the Ministry of Sport, and administered by physicians who reported not to medical ethics boards but to intelligence agencies. The program's roots trace back to at least the early 1960s when Soviet weightlifters began using testosterone and its derivatives to accelerate strength gains. By the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, anabolic steroid use was widespread across Soviet Olympic teams. By the 1970s, the program had become extraordinarily sophisticated. Athletes were given precisely calibrated doses of oral turinabol, stanozolol, and other synthetic steroids, with washout periods carefully timed to ensure that drug metabolites would clear the body before competition testing. Soviet sports pharmacologists knew exactly how long each substance remained detectable and planned doping cycles accordingly. The athletes themselves were often not told what they were being given. They were handed pills by team doctors and told to take them. Asking questions was not encouraged. The case of Tamara and Irina Press illustrates how deep suspicion ran. The Press sisters dominated women's track and field in the late 1950s and early 1960s, winning 5 Olympic gold medals between them. They were powerful, muscular athletes in an era when female competitors were expected to look, by Western standards, conventionally feminine. Western media speculated openly about their sex, using language that was often crude and xenophobic. But behind the speculation was a legitimate question about pharmaceutical enhancement. When the International Olympic Committee introduced sex verification testing and more rigorous drug screening in the late 1960s, both Press sisters abruptly retired from competition. Neither ever submitted to testing. Soviet officials offered no explanation. The sisters simply vanished from the international stage. Their records stood, their stories were never fully told, and the Press sisters were only the beginning. As the Cold War intensified and the medal count became an explicit metric of ideological superiority, the pressure to win and to dope only increased. A critical turning point came in 1983 when Dr. Grigory Vorobiev, a senior Soviet sports physician, defected to the West and began providing detailed accounts of the Soviet doping infrastructure. His testimony, combined with documents smuggled out by other defectors, painted a picture of systematic state-sponsored chemical enhancement that touched every major Olympic sport. Swimmers, runners, rowers, wrestlers, cyclists, cross-country skiers, all were part of the program. Some athletes participated willingly, understanding that their careers depended on it. Others were coerced. Many were simply never told. What makes this even more disturbing is the long-term health toll. Decades after their competitive careers ended, former Soviet athletes began reporting alarming rates of liver disease, cardiovascular failure, hormonal dysfunction, and cancer. Women who had been given androgens as teenagers developed deepened voices, facial hair, and reproductive problems that persisted for the rest of their lives. Some suffered severe depression and psychological breakdowns. A study conducted in the early 2000s by German researchers examining former East German athletes who trained under a system closely modeled on the Soviet one found dramatically elevated rates of serious health complications. The East German doping program, known as State Plan 1425, was itself a direct import of Soviet methodology, adapted and in some ways expanded by the Stasi. The human wreckage extended across generations. Some former athletes reported birth defects in their children. The full epidemiological picture remains incomplete because many records were destroyed and many victims never came forward. But doping was only one dimension of the system's toll. The psychological architecture of Soviet sports training was, in its own way, equally damaging. Athletes lived in a state of perpetual surveillance and competition, not just against foreign rivals, but against each other. The internal selection process for Olympic teams was cutthroat. 2 or 3 athletes might be viable candidates for a single roster spot, and coaches would pit them against each other in training, deliberately fostering rivalry, jealousy, and insecurity. The rationale was Darwinian. Only the most psychologically resilient would survive, and therefore the team that emerged would be the strongest possible. But resilience and trauma are not the same thing, and many athletes emerge from this process with deep psychological scars. Defectors and retired athletes have described environments of constant fear, fear of losing one's place, fear of being sent home in disgrace, fear of the knock on the door that meant a visit from a party official asking why performance had dropped. The 1980 Moscow Olympics represent perhaps the most grotesque convergence of sport, politics, and human cost. The Soviet Union was the host nation, and the pressure to dominate was immense. The Western boycott, led by the United States in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, removed many top competitors, but this did not reduce the internal pressure. If anything, it increased it. Soviet leaders could not afford a merely good performance. They needed a spectacular one. Training intensities were pushed to extremes. Doping protocols were accelerated. Athletes who were injured were told to compete or face career-ending consequences. The result was a Soviet medal haul of 195, 80 gold, 69 silver, 46 bronze. It was a staggering display of athletic dominance, and it was built on a foundation of suffering that would not be fully understood for decades. One story that captures the human dimension of this system involves Valery Borzov, the Ukrainian sprinter who won gold in both the 100 and 200 meters at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Borzov was, by Soviet standards, something of an anomaly. He was trained by Valentin Petrovsky, a coach who embraced biomechanical analysis and individualized programming at a time when many Soviet coaches still relied on brute volume. Petrovsky used film analysis and mathematical modeling to optimize Borzov's stride mechanics. The result was a sprinter of extraordinary efficiency, and Borzov's victories were among the most celebrated in Soviet sports history. But even Borzov was not immune to the system's pressures. After Munich, he was expected to repeat his dominance at the 1976 Montreal Games. When he was hampered by injury and finished only third in the 100 meters, the response from Soviet sports officials was swift and cold. His privileges were reduced. His access to training facilities was curtailed. He was, in the language of the system, being punished for failing to produce the expected output. Borzov later became a sports administrator in independent Ukraine and spoke cautiously about his experiences, but the pattern his career illustrated was universal. The system rewarded success lavishly and punished failure mercilessly, with no middle ground. The rewards, it should be said, were real and significant. Elite Soviet athletes lived in a parallel universe compared to ordinary Soviet citizens. They had access to imported goods, Western clothing, better housing, foreign travel, and a degree of personal freedom that was unimaginable to most people in the USSR. A gold medalist might receive an apartment in Moscow, a prize of almost incalculable value in a country where housing shortages were chronic and waiting lists stretched for decades. They received monthly stipends, access to special stores, and a social status that rivaled that of party officials. This created an extraordinarily powerful incentive structure. For a child from a provincial town, a career in elite sport was one of the very few paths to a materially comfortable life. And this meant that parents often cooperated willingly with the system, sending their children to distant training centers at ages as young as 6 or 7, accepting separation and harsh conditions as the price of a better future. The system exploited this aspiration ruthlessly. It dangled the carrot of privilege while wielding the stick of obscurity. The gymnastics program was perhaps the most extreme expression of all these dynamics. Soviet and later Eastern Bloc gymnastics became notorious for the youth of its competitors. Nadia Comaneci, the Romanian who scored the first perfect 10 at the 1976 Montreal Olympics, was 14. The trend toward younger and younger gymnasts was driven by biomechanical reality. Prepubescent bodies are lighter, more flexible, and more capable of the acrobatic skills that judges rewarded, but it was also driven by a more cynical calculation. Younger athletes were easier to control. They were more compliant, less likely to question authority, and more susceptible to the psychological manipulation that coaches employed. The result was a system in which children bore the physical toll of training regimens designed for adults. Growth plate injuries, stress fractures, spinal damage, and chronic joint problems were endemic. Many former Soviet gymnasts have spoken about being encouraged to maintain dangerously low body weights, being given diuretics and appetite suppressants, and being shamed and punished for eating. The culture around weight in Soviet gymnastics was pathological, and its echoes persist in the sport to this day. Here is something that rarely gets discussed. The Soviet system did not emerge in a vacuum, and it did not operate without internal critics. As early as the 1960s, there were Soviet sports scientists and physicians who raised concerns about the physical and psychological toll of elite training methods. Some published cautious papers suggesting that training volumes for young athletes should be reduced. Others argued privately that the doping program posed unacceptable health risks. These voices were, almost without exception, silenced. Some were reassigned, some were denied publication, a few were subjected to more serious consequences. The system was self-reinforcing. It produced medals, and medals justified the system's existence, and anyone who threatened the medal count was a threat to the system. This institutional logic is not unique to the Soviet Union. It recurs wherever performance metrics override human welfare, and it is worth remembering that many of the coaches and administrators who built the Soviet sports machine genuinely believed they were doing something noble. They believed in the Soviet project. They believed that athletic excellence was a form of national service, and that the sacrifices demanded of athletes were justified by the greater good. This belief made the system more resilient and more dangerous than simple cynicism ever could have. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not end the system, it fragmented it. Coaches, scientists, and methodologies dispersed across the former Soviet republics and into the wider world. Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Kazakh, and Georgian sports programs inherited pieces of the Soviet infrastructure. Chinese sports officials studied Soviet methods intensely and built their own centralized system on similar principles. The East German model, itself a Soviet derivative, influenced training cultures in Western Europe and even the United States. Elements of Soviet periodization theory, biomechanical analysis, and talent identification are now standard practice in elite sport globally. The legacy is complex. The science was often brilliant, the application often inhumane, and separating the two is not always possible. The most haunting aspect of the Soviet Olympic training system is not the doping, not the injuries, not the psychological abuse. It is the fact that it worked. It produced more Olympic champions than any other system in history. It demonstrated with terrible efficiency that human performance could be engineered on a national scale if a government was willing to invest sufficient resources and accept sufficient human cost. And this is the question that the Soviet sports legacy forces us to confront, not just as historians but as consumers and supporters of sport in the present day. What are we willing to accept in the pursuit of excellence? The athletes who stood on Soviet podiums were not machines. They were children who became teenagers, who became young adults, ground through a system that valued their output over their humanity. Many emerged with medals and shattered bodies. Some emerged with neither. The system discarded them without sentiment because there was always another child in the pipeline, another piece of raw material waiting to be processed. Today, when we watch a young gymnast execute a flawless routine, or a swimmer shatter a world record, or a sprinter cross the finish line in a time that seems to defy human limits, we are watching the distant inheritors of a tradition that began in Soviet laboratories and training halls and selection committees 60 years ago. The methods have been refined. The ethics have improved in most places to some degree. But the fundamental tension between performance and welfare, between the system and the individual, remains unresolved. The Soviet Olympic machine was not an aberration. It was a mirror, reflecting in extreme form the compromises that competitive sport has always demanded. The only question is how clearly we are willing to look into it.